we had a very interesting session in this same room before this one on consumer perceptions about the pig industry and what. And towards the end, I just asked our panel of 3 people what they saw as the big issues in terms of public communication, public perception, and these are people who are dealing with consumers or working in that area. The first answer that came up was actually the issue of antibiotic use, and the second was the issue of public misinformation. And really they're not actually independent issues, because we've got the misinformation goes broadly. I'll be talking to you about this issue of MRSA, well, Methicillin-resistant Staph aureus in the US swine industry, and some of the recent developments. So this is now a 10-year-old issue globally, which has really put a lot of political pressure on pig industries in particular, in Europe in particular, but has also has been really fertile ground for some of the perhaps most creative misinformation that we've seen in relation to the pig industry and public health hazards. So I first want to acknowledge Ji-sun, who's sitting halfway down there. She's actually, her and me, the people who've done most of the work. I just ring up people and tell them to send me swabs and try and talk them into it, but most of the lab work's been done by Ji-sun and me. So I'll give a little bit of a background. I'll talk, last year at this conference I gave one of the keynote talks on this subject and our work, and a little bit more broadly on it. So I'll just revisit, what my version of the truth was a year ago, and then we'll just look at what's happened in the last year as a more or less of an update, and where some of how we're seeing the issue now. So most of our research is going in 2 directions, in parallel to a certain extent. Craig referred to the veterinary study, which is we've essentially completed that study now, which was an 18-month longitudinal study. It was only 18 months, Craig. Just felt like 2 years. And in parallel, we've been collecting samples from pigs through the same set of veterinarians, really trying to get an understanding of what's in our swine veterinarians and how does that relate to the pig populations. And I'll just touch on some of the recent developments in the US and in Europe about the evolution of the issue, because it's got its whole scientific evolution and it's got its whole political evolution, and they're not all that closely related to one another. Just the background generally, and we're all familiar with this, Staph aureus was the first bacteria I ever saw growing on a plate in microbiology in 1972. We know it's a common inhabitant of warm-blooded animals. The books will tell us that about 30% of us in the room should have it in our nasal cavities at the moment. We also know it's an extremely important opportunistic pathogen of people. The large proportion of infections tend to be relatively of minor importance, but it goes through the whole spectrum to fatal bacteremia and very serious infections. So for most of us, it's harmless. It's opportunistically a pathogen, and the outcome can be from nothing to worry about to the worst case scenario. This whole issue started in Holland, and it started with that little girl up there who was going in for open heart surgery for a congenital birth defect. And in Holland, they screen people who were going for major surgery for MRSA. Have a completely different control setting, and they screened this girl. She didn't have an infection, but they found this MRSA in her nose, and what they found was that they hadn't seen it before. It was a weird one. She had actually had the surgery, lived, and is back working on a parent's pig farm, or playing on a parent's pig farm in that case, I guess. They then looked at this strange variant and found that they had a couple of other strange variants because they couldn't be typed with the typing system, and all 3 of those individuals were linked to pigs, which spawned the whole thing of, well, we better go and look at pigs, and sort of generated I guess the epidemic of research that's happened because of it. And this is a graph just of MRSA in animals over the decades, and the numbers of publications per year. So we can look here, we're measuring in decades, 2 publications per decade, 1 in a decade. Then I've moved through to annually. You can see there are a few publications here. And then after 2004, which was when this Dutch thing happened, I stopped counting, and some of the species we saw, 2010, there were more than 50 publications, and I stopped counting because I can't count, I ran out of fingers and toes. But essentially, we went from very little knowledge to an avalanche of information about MRSA in animals. And just for some of the jargon, like most bacteriology, virology, we've got all sorts of ways of slicing and dicing these organisms to compare them and look at the footprint. These are some of the major ones. The types that were originally found in pigs in Holland, which got the name livestock associated, were untypable with the pulse field method, which is why they recognise them. This MLST subtyping method, it tends to be a sort of a broad family subtyping. They were given christened with the sequence type 398 or conal complex 398. They had different mech typing, so this is just another sequencing technique that was a little bit different for the predominant human pathogens. And we have this SPAR typing, which is a lot more discriminatory method. And so you see, I'll be talking largely about MLST types and SPAR types. And if we can think about the MLST types as being sort of the big pigeonholes of different variants, and the SPAR typing of being within each MLST type, we have a more refined method of doing it. So I'll be talking about that. The first thing we've learned is seek and ye shall find. So people started looking at more in animal populations, and this is just data from pigs. ST398 has been predominant certainly in Europe, but in Asia, most of what people have found has been this ST9. And this collar coding will stay with us as we go through it. In North America, in pig populations, we've found quite a bit of ST5, and you can see a whole lot more sequence types. And as people tend to look more broadly, you tend to find more variation. That shouldn't surprise any of us. But the other thing is just the geographic part. So if we look in Europe, the vast majority in the first reports are all our orange collar, our ST398s, and you can see our common SPAR types here. Nearly all the Asian reports have been ST39, except in Korea with ST398. And we look in North America, we've got in Canada and US ST5s, ST398s, and much less just one report of ST9. And these are all MRSA from pig or pig-related sources. So we can see there is a bit of a variability of MRSA, and we're just trying to understand how that works. The plot gets a lot more complicated because there is yet to be an ST398 infection in North America attributed to an animal source. Okay, and that continues to be the case today. We have a group in New York who are now collaborators of ours, and they'd found out that actually in New York City there was a whole lot of ST398 methicillin susceptible Staph aureus that was causing a substantial amount of the human disease, in particularly non-invasive and also bacteremias. And they're a very molecular group, and they've published and shown that the ST398s that are circulating in the human population in New York and also have been found commonly in a prison population study in the US are distinct clades from what's in the pig. So the early literature is ST398 equals livestock equals pig. Now we know there are variants of ST398 that are human only and don't need livestock, and we've got other variants that are linked to livestock. So as usual, we do research. It gets more complex rather than more simple. We know, so these are some of the general accepted facts a year ago, and still the case, I think. ST398 MRSA occur in multiple livestock species in multiple countries. The other thing that's been very evident is for people who are in direct contact with animal populations are at high risk of being colonized, meaning if we go and swab them, we can find a high proportion of MRSA if they're in contact with a MRSA-positive animal population. So lots of studies are commonly seeing, and some even higher than this, 20 to 50% prevalence of MRSA in families, whereas if we look in the human population, the Dutch It's probably actually less than 0.5, US about 2%. So we can see people working on farms with MRSA positive stock have a much, much higher exposure risk than the general population. And then the issue is, well, how much does that really matter? And so some of the questions that are still being kicked around are, if we're working in the pig farm every day and we've got pig bacteria in our nose, are they really colonising it, or are we just sampling the barn because we've breathed a little bit of the air in, and if we wait a little bit of time, they go away? And the other part of, how much does this matter? Is this, we should be, and as usual, there's doomsday predictions about coming epidemics from this issue. So the other thing is, as I just mentioned, there's yet to be any publication that's indicated any risk of infection in any occupational group. So we're waiting after 10 years, we still haven't seen that. There's several papers now that suggest that the variants of animal origin have much lower probability of transmission between people. There's yet to be a real report of an outbreak at all, meaning a propagated epidemic. There's also quite a lot of evidence indicating that the animal-adapted variants are of relatively low virulence in the human compared to human origin ones. And this, I won't get into the specifics of that. So we've had very, very few fatalities of ST398 MRSA reported in the world. Count them on two hands over 10 years. So we know that it's thus far not a big concern. There are very current concerns in Europe because they're monitoring trends, and particularly in Denmark, which as usual does a little bit of better job in counting things and publicising things, and there's been a number of press reports out in the last couple of months about how livestock MRSA are now 1/3 of the MRSA that are detected in Denmark, and that's true, but that's largely because they're screening everyone with a livestock background for them, and they're counting whether they're colonised, not whether they're sick. The data recently out on bacteremic cases, so rather than say, well, who's carrying bacteria, look at serious infections which are having the bacteria in your blood, and this is the trend that's happened in Denmark over time. If you look on the left here, number of cases, they've got 5 million people there, they've got actually about 4 times that many pigs, and you can see these are ST398 bacteremia, and you can see they first detected it at about 2006 in Denmark as the earliest they've gone back, and you can see certainly an upward trend, realising that there's more attention being paid to it and perhaps more likelihood. It is reportable, and it's only in the last 2 years that they've had any MRSA cases, 2 in 2012. But a lot of concern about the upward slope, even though the absolute cases. But the key thing is that in 2013, and Andreas Peterson, who publishes the reports, I know him and he sent me this information just recently, it was 1.2% of all bacteremic cases. So even though it's 30% of what they're reporting in finding in people in serious infections, it's 1%. So it's still a small piece of the pie. Okay, I'll now talk about our studies on both the ecology of Staph aureus on swine farms in the US and the longitudinal study in veterinarians. And we had a group of, started with 68, ended up with 66, and they were really, I never cease to say what a fantastic group of subjects there were. We had about 98% compliance with our survey and our culture submission, so it's probably in getting people to swab themselves once a month, we probably set new records. This is where the veterinarians were located, so they were pretty representative of where pigs are in the United States. They sent us a swab every month. They gave us information on how recent pig contact they'd had, and also any events of injury infection. And at ASV this year, and I'll get back into that, we took a one-time swab from 41 of the participants we could find to actually look at the numbers of Staph aureus that they were carrying, and I'll come back to that. So this is what we found in the vets. So if we went over time, we're running it around about in the 60s for Staph aureus prevalence. The normal human population is about 30. So our vets are carrying about twice as many of them are culture positive than you would think. And if we look at the MRSA, we're in the 5, 6, I think overall 6 point something %, a little bit up and down. First, no trend of anything going up and down over time. The key thing here is the comparison to Europe, because the Dutch published after when we were about halfway through that about 65% of their veterinarians were Staph aureus positive, so exactly like our industry. 44% of their swine veterinarians were MRSA positive. So that we're sort of an order of magnitude lower in MRSA prevalence, even though we're exactly the same in Staph aureus present in our swine veterinary population. And the advantage of why we wanted to do this in veterinarians at farmers is that veterinarians generally tend to move around and get exposed to multiple animal populations. So if you're interested in temporal trends, they're much better to study than people on swine farms who are always breathing the same air from the same pig. So what we're interested in seeing is how permanent these colonisation patterns. And and as I said, what we saw here in the variants in the colour scheme is predominantly ST398 in this particular spar type, a lot of ST9, this particular spar type, and a couple of spar types of ST5. So we saw this variation, but again, very, very few MRSA isolates, a lot of MSSA. And these correspond, and I'll show you later, to what we're finding in the pigs. So what's in swine veterinary noses predominantly is what's in pig populations. In terms of were these people persistently infected or not, and so we had an index here of, if you were 18 out of 18 swabs positive, you were up at 1, and the rest, we only had one veterinarian that was never Staph aureus positive. And you can see the distribution, obviously bimodal here, that we have a group of individuals at this end where we always or nearly always got Staph aureus out of them. So you might say, well, they're potentially persistently colonised, and we have a bunch of other people that were now and then colonised. Okay, so we divided them into intermittent carriers, persistent carriers, and we can argue about what the definition of that is, but there were the two groups we looked at ASV. We hunted them down, got swabs, and say, quantitatively, is there a difference we can see in the numbers of organisms that they carry? These are charts that Ji-Sun put together in the colour scheme, and all we're wanting to point out here is that 3 pie charts here horizontally correspond to 18 months of results from individual veterinarians. So in a veterinarian like that, where the pattern's unchanged, that means we got the same spar type out of that veterinarian for 18 months. And you can see we have a numbers of veterinarians, both of ST398, ST9 particularly, where we got almost, or in some cases often, the same spar type out of the same veterinarian for 18 months. And that gives you a pretty good feeling that that bug is living in that individual's nose, because for the most part, with some exceptions, they're going to multiple farms. The ones with the dots are the MRSA positive individuals. So we have some individuals that were responsible for most of our MRSA isolations, and some of them tended to be colonised in the long term. No surprise there. Our intermittent carriers, and this is just to really show the variability in the colour scheme. Because if we've got some individuals where they went through the whole spectrum, if we go down this individual here and just sort of look, they ended up with a number of consecutive months, in fact, with MRSA colonisation. But you can see within individuals, they were coming and going and getting different variants over time, tending to suggest there's a lot of exposure. But most of those colonisation events are transient in those individuals. Okay. At ASV, as I mentioned, we wanted to do quantitative swabs. So this question, because someone asked me in Denmark, well, I don't believe that they're really permanently colonised, that, have you shown that they carry more organisms or not? So we did that at ASV. We found 41% of our subjects, and most of them took their nasal swabs in a very public place, shall we say. 18 of them were persistently carriers. based on our definition. 23 of them weren't. We took the swab at the meeting. We got time since contact. And we did quantitative cultures by direct plating without enrichment. So the first thing, as you'd expect, nearly all of our permanently colonised people were culture positive. Remember, we didn't do enrichment here. We always had before. And the persistently colonised individuals had more Staph aureus. Sorry, I've got a mix in the animation here. You can see 30% of our intermittently colonised, so what you'd expect, background in the population. And you can see the graph here shows log colony forming units, and you can see this is our persistent carriers and our intermittent carriers. And there's about a 2 log difference in the numbers of staph that were in those individuals. So there is a lot of literature on the human side that indicates host factors are actually important in the likelihood of people carrying Staph aureus. Our data support that completely. Our takeaway is that host factors are important. A minority of individuals are likely to become permanently colonised by exposure to these animal variants. Most people exposed in animal populations won't become permanently colonised. The other part of the story is none of our veterinarians had any health events related to this, and we have a different survey showing we've got, thousands of years of swine veterinary experience with almost no events of Staph aureus infection reported. So clinical risk seems to be small. In swine herds, I've been involved in several studies. The one I'm speaking on now, we're 31 farms through 36 that we're doing. The individuals in the project were invited to submit samples from a farm, 1 farm each. So again, we got very broad national representation and not multiple farms from the same veterinarian. So just trying to get a broad net of what we've got. We just got them to get 20 nasal swabs from growing pigs. We did the spar typing, and going forward we're looking at antimicrobial resistance and enterotoxin production for different reasons. We've also got information on genotype of the pigs and on antimicrobial use. So that's the next part of the project which hasn't been done here. The interesting things, we've only had 1 farm that we got no Staph aureus from. That's what, probably even that's surprising. The other thing that's really important, 31 farms, only 1 farm's been MRSA positive. And so I think between the veterinary data and the farm data and previous studies, all the evidence points to the fact that MRSA in the US pig industry is here, but at much, much lower prevalence than in most European countries. And so that can start a conversation about what might have contributed to that. But one of the great bits of misinformation is that, well, it's been antimicrobial growth promoting use that's caused the MRSA epidemic, without pointing out that Denmark got their first MRSA cases more than half a decade after they stopped using antimicrobial growth promotants. And the fact we still have them here and we're struggling to find any MRSA in this study. And we, as I said, we know it's there, but it's at much, much lower prevalence. And this is, again, back to the colour scheme showing, so the size of the bubble shows the number of proportion of pigs on the farm that were positive. That's our 1 positive MRSA farm. And I have to point out, we knew before it that farm was positive. We weren't going to include it, but when we'd had 15 negative farms, we decided to bring that in so that we had a positive control farm. 100% of the pigs were positive. So really, of the farms of unknown status, we yet to find a MRSA positive farm. And the key things to look at, again, how much blue of the ST398 is broadly distributed, the greens, the ST9s, the reds, the ST5s. Those 3 variants account for the vast majority of what we're finding in pigs. They've probably been adapted and living in the pig for a very long period of time, and the appearance, but they do correspond with the variants that MRSA has been reported in. Just to look at it a different way, if we look at all the spar types, we've got our veterinarians and our pigs, and then we look at these predominant spar types in the middle here, belonging to those sequence types. 82% of those predominant spar types are in the veterinary population, and they're 92% of what's in the pigs. So very, very close correlation between these very prevalent variants in pigs are also very prevalent in the swine veterinary population, which indicates for our veterinarians, most of the Staph aureus they're coming from, to extent that arguably there's been a displacement of human origin Staph aureus by swine origin Staph aureus. The scaremongering hasn't gone away. I'd say, and we've reviewed this in detail, most of the data indicate to date that the public health risk of Staph aureus, even the occupational health risk for people, is extremely small. As I mentioned, in Denmark and also in Germany, there's some evidence of increase, but still a small absolute impact. Hasn't been almost, as far as I'm aware of, clinically significant infections in occupational exposed people are hard to find. Most of the serious infections are reported have been in elderly, medically compromised people with no contact with pigs. But we still have this steady drumbeat of publications that are talking up the risk, and a lot of them emanating from the southeastern region of our country here. I just want to point one out from a point of view of inference, and I think I'll use this in my teaching. This is a study from the group at Chapel Hill, where they were looking at people coming into a hospital in eastern North Carolina, and controls here of people who were swab negative for Staph aureus, and they were looking at Staph carriage here, and their cases here were people that were positive. So you can see they got about 100 of each, and what they wanted to do was compare it to by the region, their residence, and pig density. So they had three groups, and they looked at permitted pigs within within a square mile. So they had a 0 group, a 0 to 149, greater than 149. And then they looked at it by farrowing swine, then they looked at it by non-farrowing swine, and then they looked at it by living it within 1 mile of a concentrated animal feeding operation, yes, no. The things to point out, the comparison group is the 0 group, no pigs involved, okay? And they're looking at, how's the risk change? So what I've got here, this is the high pig group. A number less than 1 means that numerically there was less Staph aureus there than would be predicted overall. And so by comparing to this group, guess what? A little bit lower, quite a lot lower, a little bit lower. So in all 4 comparisons, the high swine density groups were below the other the no density groups on all 4 measures. Okay, so what we look at is actually there's only one statistically significant finding there, which is in this group, which happens to consist of 7 people in one group and 20 in another, and it says, well, in that group they're 4.76 times higher than the control group. So if we're saying we're trying to understand this relationship between swine density and Staph aureus carriage, I would have been inclined to think the fact that in all cases the high swine density group was below the no swine density group would mean we don't have grounds for a very strong association. If we look at what is included, and this is cut and pasted from the study, moderate densities of swine are associated with MRSA nasal carriage, it is MRSA, detected by PCR. This is supported by past evidence. They don't make any comment in the discussion that the fact that the high density group was lower than the 0 swine group anywhere through the paper. And so there's a problem there of their inferential processes, and there's also a problem of the quality of review of these sorts of papers. And we have a whole series of papers coming out like that Liz and I could spend our whole life in trying to point out their shortcomings, but are getting published and are having a big impact on opinion. So you can tell me I'm biased. My view is I think they're biased. So the summary. Livestock MRSA, it's a difficult public relations issue for the swine industry. I think accumulating data point to much, much lower prevalence in the US compared to many European countries, both on the vet side and the pig side. And I think going forward, the publications coming out on this issue are going to be a case study of misinformation and biased science. But that's my opinion.